Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust webinar. We've all witnessed the devastating developments in Ukraine over the weeks since the 24th of February. The international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been chiefly the imposition of severe sanctions on Russia and Russian individuals. Some reporting over the developing situation has focused significantly on Israel, in part due to Israel's emergence as a leading mediator between Putin and Zelensky, but also in part due to discussions around sanctions and violations of international law and the continued distortions over the Israeli-Arab conflict. To unpack the law behind the comparisons that have been made and to address the legal responses we have witnessed, it is a great pleasure to introduce Professor Eugene Kontorovich. Professor Kontorovich was born in Ukraine, lives in Israel, and is a professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia School of Law, specializing in constitutional and international law. He is the author of dozens of academic articles in the leading law reviews and peer-reviewed journals, and his scholarship has been cited in leading international law cases in the US and abroad. He is the head of the International Law Department at the Kohelet Policy Forum, a think tank based in Jerusalem, and he's recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on international law and the Israeli-Arab conflict. I'd ask our audience, please, to put your questions into the Q&A function for the discussion after Professor Kontorovich's opening remarks. Eugene, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. So everybody's engrossed, of course, by the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is quite extraordinary as a significant extended land war in modern times with maneuvering of armor, artillery, all played out over a long period of time in Europe. And of course, the human tragedy is quite significant. And there are very few times when I've been so unhappy to be right. I've been writing about Russian aggression against its neighbors since 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine, and even before that, since 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia and annexed parts of Georgia, which remain under its, which set up puppet governments in parts of Georgia, which remain under its control to this day. It was shortly thereafter rewarded with hosting the Olympics in Sochi, not far from occupied Georgian territory. So the Russia's belief that it could get away with this has been long in being built, and has been built in large part by the international community's reaction to previous aggressions and previous takeovers of territory, starting with Georgia in 2008, right up to President Biden's recent implication that a minor incursion, further additional minor incursion into Ukrainian territory would not activate the diplomatic immune system of the West and would go unanswered by the West. One of the important things to understand about this conflict is that Putin is not without arguments. Putin's aggression against Ukraine is, of course, against international law, but unlike all but the most cartoonish Harry Potter bad guys, Putin comes clothed in claim of right. He has arguments, he has claims, and it's important to understand these claims because they are legally and functionally almost identical to the claims made by Palestinians and other critics of Israel against Israeli control of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, parts of Jerusalem, and other territories. These Putin's arguments are the Palestinians' arguments, and vice versa. And it's important to understand how that is the case. Now, of course, if you've read the papers, you may not have been alerted to this. It's definitely the case that critics of Israel, Palestinian activists, want to use the mobilization of the international community against Israel against Russia to turn that anger also subsequently against Israel. I don't think that's interesting for these people. Whatever is going on in the world is only relevant insofar as it relates to Israel. And were it not for their arguments, I don't think it would be appropriate to insert, to refer to how this relates to Israel. There's a lot of human suffering now. It's not about Israel. But at the same time, it's ironic that not only does, if you were to look at Putin's arguments, you'll see that not only it does not provide a template for dealing harshly with Israel. If anything, Putin's aggression against Ukraine demonstrates the need for countries to accept and affirm Israel's territorial rights to Judea and Samaria. Okay, so let's start with Putin. Putin has an argument, which he made, which is made for a long time. So let's just take an example. Take Crimea, as Vladimir Putin did in 2014. Putin's argument was not just that Crimea should be part of Russia because he's stronger, because he wants to. He had a very concrete argument. His argument was that the people in Crimea are primarily Russians. They're primarily Russian-speaking. They have, for much of history, been under Russian rule, parts of the Russian Empire. And the way they came to be part of the Ukraine is arbitrary. It doesn't coincide with self-determination. Right? That's a popular buzzword. And Putin invoked it, I think, perhaps accurately. I think it's quite clear that many Crimeans, probably most Crimeans, would not have wanted to remain part of Russia, probably not 90%, like they said in the referendum that Putin subsequently conducted, but that's just the only number that comes out of Russian ballot machines. But certainly this was a Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian area, historically part of Russia. Now, the international community uniformly regarded Putin's aggression against Ukraine, Donbass, as a violation of international law and a violation of Ukrainian territorial integrity. So the question is, why is the international community unanimously convinced that Ukraine's territorial integrity extends to areas that were historically Russian and that are populated by a majority ethnic Russian or Russian-speaking population? The answer is simple. The answer is simple. Because there's a basic rule of international law that is used to establish the boundaries of new countries. And that is not asking people in each sub-region or neighborhood of that country what country they would like to be part of. That is a recipe for endless conflict. Indeed, that is similar to what happened with India and Pakistan, with results that continue to bleed today. The rule is simple. When a new country is created, as Ukraine was in 1990, as Russia was in 1990, the borders of that country are the borders of the last top-level administrative unit in that territory in the time of independence. So let's take what's a top-level administrative unit? So in the UK, it would be Scotland, Wales, England. In the Soviet Union, in America, it would be United States. And in the Soviet Union, it was composed of Soviet socialist republics. The largest was Russia. The second largest was Ukraine. These were the two most important. As a matter of fact, both had separate seats in the General Assembly, interestingly enough. Crimea had always been part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, and before that, the Russian Empire, and was part of Russia. In the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev redrew the internal borders to put Crimea in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Didn't ask anybody in Crimea, didn't ask anybody in Russia, didn't ask anyone in Ukraine. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party. He didn't have to ask anyone. So it is hard to think of a less democratic way, a way less concerned with self-determination of peoples, to draw borders than this. Nonetheless, that became the official borders of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. When Ukraine becomes independent, those are its borders to this very day. And the international community accepts this principle for determining borders, both in the former Soviet Union, in Africa, in former Yugoslavia, around the world, because unless you have because the principle is certain and easy to apply, right? You look at what were the borders immediately before independence of the top level administrative unit, those become the borders today. Even when it conflicts with ethnic self-determination or puts an unhappy minority, in this case, let's say Russians, under the sovereignty of a larger majority. Because most political boundaries, unless you're on some Caribbean island, will group a minority with a majority. It's almost impossible to draw political boundaries that are, let's say, ethnically pure, and those boundaries would be difficult in many other ways. Putin's argument, on the other hand, is that areas where Russians live, areas where Russians live, cannot be under Ukrainian sovereignty. They cannot be under the sovereignty of another country. They need to be under Russian rule. That ethnicity draws borders rather than borders drawing borders. And of course, that philosophy has led to numerous wars of conquest. And when you say that, Ukraine can't have areas with a Russian minority, what you're saying is Ukraine can't really be a country, because every country, most countries, have minorities in them. Right? It's almost inevitable. And if a country is disabled from having a minority under its rule, under its sovereignty, that every minority needs to go with some other country where they are the majority, that is a recipe for constant conflict and infinite regress of secessionist wars over borders. Let's apply this now to the Israeli-Arab conflict. The previous administrative unit, top-level administrative unit, when Israel declared independence, undebatable, was the mandate for Palestine, the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. And its borders at the moment of independence were absolutely clear. There was no doubt about this. When the mandate expired, its borders included the areas from the river to the sea, including the area that was not a separate geographic or geopolitical entity in any way at the time, but subsequently came to be known as the West Bank. That was not an existing subdivision, top level or otherwise. The top level subdivision was mandatory Palestine. And upon Israel's independence, that would be its presumptive borders, even when those borders are invaded subsequently by enemy states like Jordan and occupied, when Israel regains those borders, to which it originally had a sovereign entitlement as of 1948, it, of course, should not be treated as an occupier. Let me give you an example in this case. Let's say that Ukrainian arms succeed extraordinarily and don't just stop the Russian advance and don't just repel the Russian advance, but actually manage to retake, right? This is a big question. Can Ukraine now agree to peace without Crimea? Does Ukraine have to stop at Crimea? Let's say that Ukrainian force, Russians right now are making a Western thrust in the Donbass region. Let's say the Ukrainians, miraculously, right, it doesn't seem like it's in the cards now, not only push them back, not only stop them, but push them back and retake Donbass, retake Crimea. Would anybody say that Ukraine is an occupying power in those areas simply because Russia has held those areas for nearly a decade and expelled probably most of the people who would be sympathetic to Ukrainian rule or force them to flee? Or, okay, if 8 years is not enough, what if another 10 years goes by? That's it? Now, if Ukraine were to retake these territories, nope, now it's an occupation. Ukrainians can never move back into those places. It's It's unbelievable that any member of the international community would say that. Indeed, I have some proofs that they would not say that. And of course, this is the Palestinian argument, that the borders, Israel's borders, should not be determined by the previous political borders. Those borders should not have continuity. Rather, at most, Israeli sovereignty should be confined to areas where only Jews live, and wherever, in any sub-area where you may find Palestinian Arabs, that has to be excluded from Israeli sovereignty. Arabs can only be ruled by an Arab government. That, of course, is to treat Israel not as a normal state, right? That is to say, wherever the Arabs are, and we see this right now. This is the argument over Sheikh Jarrah, right? It's in the middle of Jerusalem, city with a Jewish majority. It's a neighborhood, small neighborhood with an Arab majority. That's it. Israeli law should not extend there. Jews should not be able to live there. This is the Arab version, the Palestinian version of Putin's Ruski Mir theory. The greater Russian world, where the Russian people are, Russian language is spoken, that is where the sovereignty of other countries has to stop. And it's rejected for Putin, of course. Has not been strongly rejected in the past. The international community didn't do much about it. But indeed, it's only entertained in the case in the case of the Palestinians. It's rejected when these kind of arguments, ethnic borders type arguments, are rejected around the world. And indeed, the mandatory borders of Lebanon, the mandatory borders of Iraq, which was Mesopotamia, a British mandate, mandatory borders of Syria, indeed Jordan, which was created out of the Mandate for Palestine. All of those borders of those countries at the time of their independence, their mandatory borders are treated as their de jure borders, no matter what, even if they're unfair, even if, as all of them do, they deny serious, credible claims of ethnic self-determination of the Kurds, say in Iraq, of the Druze and other groups in Syria, of Muslims in Lebanon. Only in the case of Israel is this exception not made. I think it's very important. Putin's argument is the Palestinians' argument, and vice versa, structurally and logically. We'll just add another point here. It's not surprising that Putin thought he would get away with this. Now, people say it's against international law, but Putin may have had reason to believe that international law has, for many people, become really a coded language simply to talk about Israel with little relevance outside of Israel. So, for example, much is made of Israeli settlements in occupied territory, correct? A huge deal. I don't need to tell you. Since Russia's takeover, not even a decade ago, of Crimea, hundreds of thousands of Russian settlers have moved into the area. Russia has promoted settlement policies in Abkhazia, occupied area of Georgia. In both these cases, these matters have been under investigation by the ICC. And the ICC indeed has general jurisdiction over the conflict in Ukraine. When the ICC prosecutor 2 years ago announced that she was going to be moving to a full investigation of Russian crimes in Ukraine, she listed the possible crimes that might be committed in Crimea. And though she had previously considered it as something that her investigation would extend to, she did not include the hundreds of thousands of Russians who moved in to Crimea. Now, that's extraordinary, given the comparable treatment, the parallel treatment of Israel, and not a single international legal actor, not a single professor, not a single, shall we say, Amnesty International, criticized the prosecutor for excluding this. And Putin might think, if he thought about that, if he stopped to think about international law at all, I think international law is a ritual, a scapegoating ritual for putting the guilt of the international community, putting the guilty feelings upon a small, weak country, Israel, and has no relevance for a large country, large, powerful country, like his. And indeed, now that everybody, so been talking about this for a long time, now that everybody agrees Russia's the bad guy, the international community has a lot of explaining to do. I think the question, I think it's become quite clear by the actions of the past 10 years of the international community, has truly proven that all this discussion of settlements was not something they meant generally, but really just a special way to talk about Jews living in their historic homeland.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Eugene. The territorial issues that you've covered reveal certainly an enormous double standard. But when we consider calls for sanctions on Israel to follow the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia by people who say the violations of international law are the same, where should we really begin with the response? And as you're contemplating perhaps the answer to that, may I put to you one of the first questions that has come through essentially on this subject? The questioner asks, could you address the question of sanctions? Specifically, what is the difference between those those employed against an aggressor like Russia on the one hand, and those employed by the aggressors themselves, such as the Arab League boycott against Israel? Certainly the language does seem to be a mirror.
Right, so the one should not be overly impressed by the the use of the same word for a wide variety of similar conduct. This would kind of be like using the fact that people settled the American West as talking about Israeli settlements in Judea and Samaria, which I happen to think illegal, but like for reasons entirely different from American settlers in Colorado, and the fact that you have a similar word, the same word, really tells us nothing. Sanctions is a general term for governmental economic responses to other countries. First of all, and they exist on many different levels. The sanctions of the Arab League were, to a large extent, legitimate, completely legitimate. As the Arab League countries were in a state of war with Israel. They weren't hiding it. Israel was in a state of war with them. They were open, formal, declared war. You're certainly not obligated and not necessarily expected to have economic ties. You can, but you're certainly not. Certainly, economic coercion is a tool of war and something you can use against hostile powers. What made the Arab League boycott illegitimate was their attempt to rope in neutrals into their boycott, right? That is to say, to the extent that the Arab League simply said, we don't want to do business with Israel, it's great. Israel wasn't necessarily dying to do business with them. The Arab League boycott was problematic because it was coercive towards third parties, not party to the conflict. In particular, companies that didn't do business, that did business with Israel, the Arab League would say, you can't do business with us, right? An attempt to extend the boycott to second parties, and then even indeed to third parties. If you do business with a company that do business, and that, seeking to basically pull others into your conflict was seen as problematic or illegitimate, but in particular, as it was being used particularly not as a tool to stop aggression, additionally, but as a tool to stop the creation of the State of Israel, the existence of the State of Israel, which we know because the boycott was declared when Israel was created. It was a response to the creation of Israel and nothing else. And similarly, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement makes clear that the problem with Israel began in 1948. The Amnesty International report made clear that the so-called Israeli apartheid began in 1948. So the complaint is with the existence of the State of Israel. So so boycotts are just a tool. Right? That's like saying, the Russians are shooting bullets at the Ukrainians. So isn't it bad when the IDF shoots bullets at Hamas terrorists? You could turn it around. The Ukrainians are also shooting bullets at the Russians. So maybe nobody, so what's it mean? Bullets are just a tool, right? And sanctions are just a tool. Right? They're a political, diplomatic, and potentially military tool. And they're employed. They can be employed for good, and they can be employed for evil. This is very similar to the argument that proponents of boycotts, divestments from Israel, they say, but wait, look, boycotts were used by the American civil rights movement. True, they were also used by the Nazis against the Jews. Right? The fact that you use the same word or that you use a same tool tells you nothing about the legitimacy of the ends. You really have to look further. At the same time, certainly people who say that the kind of boycotts that are being used against Russia should be applied to Israel are really expecting people to ignore basically everything that has happened currently in the conflict. Russia is doing something that very few countries try to do these days. It is trying to, in a war of aggression, a war where they have no plausible claim of self-defense and didn't even really invoke a claim of self-defense. They invoked a claim of ethnic solidarity, basically. Obviously, Israel was not invoking a claim of ethnic solidarity in 1967 because all the Jews had been expelled or were not permitted to live in areas under Arab control. Israel was invoking a pure claim of self-defense. And indeed, most relevant to Judea and Samaria, Israel did not even attack Jordan in its initial preemptive strikes in the first days of the war, and did not plan to attack Jordan, and only started moving against Judean forces in the West Bank when they joined the Syrian-Egyptian axis on the third or fourth day of the war. So it's a response to something. So Russia's done a lot of terrible things. Right? They've killed people in the UK, poisoned entire districts. Quite extraordinary. They've nibbled away parts of countries. So we see even these kind of sanctions are not even a normal international response to territorial aggression per se. It's only in this phase where Russia's clear goal is the complete extermination of a neighboring state that these sanctions are being employed. And these sanctions, of course, are discretionary. Nobody's suggesting these sanctions are mandatory, that there's a legal obligation. Right? These sanctions are taken by countries as a political tool based on their own political convenience, which is why countries dial their sanctions to specifically the level of economic discomfort that they themselves are comfortable with. Right? If there was some kind of boycott the aggressor obligation, it's not clear that any of you would have electricity now. So this is a choice that countries make to balance their own interests. So they engage in these sanctions as a political act. But no one suggests it's mandatory, even in the face of aggression. Witness Russia's engagement with the international community since 2008. I myself thought that at least the very symbolic sanction of excluding Russia from the Middle East Quartet, a international forum for pressuring Israel to make territorial concessions to the Palestinians, would have been appropriate after 2008, when Russia took territory from Georgia, but nobody in the international community, seemed to be of that opinion. Thus, the bar for sanctions seems to be extraordinarily and uniquely high. Indeed, if we go back to President Biden's statement, it seems quite clear that had Russia finished the business more promptly and successfully, these kind of sanctions would not have been seen. And it was really only Putin's going beyond the minor incursion for which he'd been greenlit that has resulted in these sanctions. So it's true, the fact that the international community is willing to do it here, I think means really nothing other than, I would add another important point. It's very absurd when the Ukrainian president is begging Israel to serve as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine for the, for BDS activists to say, oh, and Israel's just like Russia, we should treat Israel like Russia. Obviously, Zelensky doesn't think it's just like Russia. Otherwise, he wouldn't think they should be the mediator. Right? Israel is being turned to by both Zelensky and Russia because it's seen as a paragon of integrity that understands the interests of both sides. Why would Zelensky want a territorial aggressor as his mediator? Right? It seems they'd have exactly the wrong interests. Right? You wouldn't want like a colleague of the crook to be the judge of the crook. I guess once we see And we see that there's not sanctions against China, and we see that there's really not sanctions against anyone, except in this particular unusual circumstance. There were also some sanctions, very mild, after Crimea. So really invading a country under no plausible claim of self-defense and annexing its territory immediately is the kind of thing that may trigger sanctions. And thus, if there's any analogies to be drawn, it seems quite clear that the international community should greatly reinforce its sanctions against Iran, which is an aggressor state, actively trying to topple and install puppet regimes in numerous countries around the Middle East. And much like Putin is bent on the destruction of Ukraine, says Ukraine's not a real country. The Iranians say that Israel is not a real country, and that they are clear about their announcements of their intent to destroy Israel. So if there's any precedent, right, I think one important precedent, people should not be surprised about what Putin's doing. He's done it elsewhere on a smaller scale, and he's talked about doing it for a long time. That is to say, Putin has repeatedly said Ukraine is not a real country. What's that mean? Right? A clear announcement of his intent or his stated claim of right to destroy Ukraine, and nobody took him seriously. That's just big talk, right? So certainly the Ukrainians, right, would be much more grateful if the sanctions of the international community didn't come when the Russian forces were in Kyiv, but before the Russians attacked, right? So this is the sanctions now serve more as a way of assuaging Western guilt for allowing this to happen, I think, than stopping it, right? If it stopped already, Ukrainians will pay a tremendous price. Why not learn a lesson and act differently with Iran, right? Imposed ruinous sanctions, the biggest sanctions ever, as Biden says, beforehand, right? Why, but obviously it may be more tempting to, maybe they won't do it. So it would be a cold comfort for them to, God forbid, destroy Israel in a nuclear attack. And then the international community, then it's going to be sanctions like you can't believe. Wow, it's going to be such sanctions you've never seen such sanctions. Okay, great. Who's going to be better? Who's going to be better off?
Eugene, we've had questions flooding in. So
Great.
if you're able to keep your responses short, we'll cover as many of them as possible. Before we come back to the issue of sanctions on individuals, there's a key question here relative to international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict. And the questioner asks, without a formal declaration of war, what is the legal status of the conflict? And how does this affect the treatment of prisoners and also of armed civilians?
I think it's quite clear that in modern times, no declaration of war is either needed or expected. Countries just do not proceed under a declaration of war. And Geneva Conventions make very clear that failing to declare war does not waive or suspend any provisions of the Geneva Convention. You have a war, right? What they call it for their internal purposes is not important. This is clear in international armed conflict. There's a difficulty of classification here, and all aspects of international humanitarian law apply.
A few questions touching on Israel's role as a mediator. One in particular asks you to comment on the mediation issue. Has Israel attempted to mediate between Russia and Ukraine to the extent, I suppose, that whatever is in the public domain? If so, and why, and with what result? And does this impact the wider context of Middle East diplomatic relations? Now, you've touched on Israel.
We don't know the results. I mean, it's too early to know the results. I think typically these mediation processes are vain and futile. Unless nobody's going to get these countries to change their views of their own interests. Right? It's not like you're mediating. It's not like you're mediating some kind of dispute between business partners or like a husband and a wife. They probably thought about it a long time and really thoroughly examined their interests before they got into this situation. And even as the situation progresses, the mediation structure could be useful if one of them decides, wants a compromise and wants to climb down at some point. which would hopefully happen soon. This could be a vehicle for doing so. So far, there have not been clear results, and maybe there never will be. There's mediation in many international conflicts. Most of it is vain and futile. There's certainly huge dangers to Israel here. Any kind of compromise is likely to not thrill everybody and to unthrill many people, and Israel could be left blamed for that. There's a possibility that Israel will, broker some kind of amazing deal and get extraordinary international recognition, but it's a very risky strategy. I suppose they're doing it because the prime minister has been asked to do it. I think it's hard to say no. It's a risky gambit on his part. He does not have much longer to be prime minister, which may make it more attractive to him. But so far, no harm or benefit has really occurred from it, other than it does put Israel in a potentially difficult situation. You'd think it would be, at least something that you could say, well, it's ridiculous to compare Israel to Russia when Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has asked for and accepted the mediation of Israel. But you can never get rid of those arguments, so it's not even useful for that.
Is there also potentially a risk that Israel may legitimize the argument that self-determination can trump existing borders via its role as a mediator?
That's a good point. I had not thought about that, but I think it's being asked to serve as a mediator, I think, without taking any substantive position on the claims of either parties. And certainly parties are free to come to whatever deal. I think if Ukraine accepts a deal, it would be absurd to treat it as that would give some kind of Russian recognize some de facto Russian sovereignty over Crimea and Donbass. This would not be a legitimization of the principle of ethnic self-determination. It would be an example that coercion can work. It would not be a precedent. It would be an example that we even accept coerced results in international law as a real alternative.
A questioner from the US is asking whether Russia has pointed to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia and the recognition of the subsequent republics, including Kosovo, and the arguments of self-determination in that context as justification for Putin's recognition of Luhansk and Donetsk, and whether there would be legitimacy to such a comparison.
Kosovo is a favorite point the Russians make. Kosovo was an example of a very, very rare deviation from this principle of determining borders, because Kosovo was not a top-level republic within the Yugoslav Federation. More complicated question what its status is within the rump Yugoslavia subsequent to breakup. But this is not a straightforward application of these general rules. And indeed, the international community understood that. And when Kosovo was recognized, many countries said this was a sui generis situation, a one-off, right? What Justice Scalia likes to call, a one-way ticket, good for this ride only, right? Which is not how we normally think of international law. Law is supposed to be general. And certainly the treatment of Kosovo by international community was aberrational. And also greatly angered Russia, which was allied with Serbia. So they use Kosovo all the time, and it just shows the dangers of deviating from this principle and making what seem to be sympathetic exceptions. At the same time, if it wasn't for the Kosovo thing, I'm sure Putin would still be doing the same thing. That is to say, we shouldn't think that it's the presence of particular arguments that motivate these big political actions. But that is certainly a serious argument that they have to contend with. And I think they're not interested in pointing to Israel, but they could say, look, the Palestinians, that's another example. I think they choose not to use right. That's an example where the international community doesn't recognize previous top-level borders. So why should we? They don't make that example, I think, for political reasons, but they could well.
And a further question as to the Russian argument, if there was an attempt at justification against Chechen independence and ethnic borders in that case. you familiar with what?
No, the Russians don't find a need to be consistent. I can tell you, one of the biggest critics of Israel's so-called settlements in the West Bank is Turkey. They find the consistency is countries make these arguments for political reasons. I think it's not serious to believe that they really care much about them, or that the arguments motivate behavior. The international law provides some menu for political diplomacy arguments to choose from. But Russia sees no contradiction between anything and anything.
I want to move slowly from the examples that we've been looking at in Eastern Europe to the one that you began with, essentially with the formation of the State of Israel. And we've got a question. In the case of the former Yugoslavia, the Badinter Commission advised that self-determination must be addressed within the boundaries established by uti possidetis juris, the customary rule that you referenced. So how does this play out in the case of Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria?
Yeah, okay, so just to be clear, what this means, uti possidetis means you go by the last top level administrative units. In Yugoslavia, that was Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Montenegro. This is why the international community opposed successfully and militarily Serbian efforts to carve out a Serbian secessionist state from Bosnia. And when applied to Israel or to any mandatory territory, you basically look at the boundaries of what was there immediately before, what the top level governance unit was at the moment of independence. So in Israel, this would mean a mandate for Palestine. And the mandate for Palestine, which was never partitioned, but the United Nations recommended partition, that recommendation was neither binding nor accepted. The boundaries of Palestine were absolutely clear in early 1948. And they included all of Jerusalem, they included all of Judea and Samaria, they included Gaza. This, when you apply this principle, that would be the basis. That would be the default borders. And of course, self-determination can be achieved through means other than independent states, as indeed it is for almost all peoples in the world.
There have been a few questions picking up on your analysis of the application of uti possidetis juris to Israel's formation. One asks, was the Declaration of Independence made about specific land, or could it be construed as applying to the whole of the British Mandate area? Could you comment briefly on that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I wrote an article in Mosaic magazine a few months ago discussing this in some detail. The Declaration of Independence is a normal declaration of independence. That is to say, like most Declaration of Independences, including ones made around that time in Indonesia, other countries, Declarations of Independence don't typically stipulate borders. They're about something different. They're saying, hey, world, we got a country, we got a government, we have some territory. We profess to be a member of the international community. The point, and often nations are created in war or during conflict when they don't have the wherewithal to think of borders. Interestingly, some lawyers, some of Ben-Gurion's government lawyers, suggested that he should include borders, and that how can you have a Declaration of Independence with borders? And he says, show me one that does, whatever. It's unusual. What's the most famous Declaration of Independence? The United States Declaration of Independence makes no claims about borders, and claims and disputes between the United States and the UK regarding the northern borders relating to Canada were only resolved in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. In other words, much later. No one really knew what the border was. So the Declaration of Independence consciously took no position on borders because it did not see that that was its role, nor for the invocation of this doctrine do you need any explicit invocation of borders. Otherwise, it wouldn't have much use, because when it turns out most countries don't sort of staple a map to the Declaration of Independence.
And the next in the series of queries on the application of this principle, is your argument affected by the UN partition plan?
I just mentioned that, no, for like many, many reasons. So first of all, the partition plan had no legal force. It was not binding. But even if it's, let's say, should have had, and by the way, you can tell that, you can read the partition plan, it says recommend. That's the verb it uses. They don't profess to take any action. General Assembly does not have the authority to redraw the boundaries of mandates or any other kind of political units. But most importantly, it did not in fact change the borders of the mandate. Right. And the way this rule works is you look at the borders of that unit at the time of independence, not what people suggested should be the borders. As I mentioned, all these other mandatory territories had ethnic minorities, such as the Kurds in Iraq and Sunni Arabs in Lebanon, who are unhappy to be a minority in a Christian majority country, all of whom argued powerfully and in some cases to sympathetic international audiences for partition. The idea of partition was around in sort of everywhere. If not actually implemented, then it does not affect the application of this rule.
I mentioned, there's just one further question, I suppose, in that series, and it's that some countries do break apart as a result of internal conflict, South Sudan versus North Sudan, given as an example. And the question asks, could that example be applied to Israel? So how does it, the formation of Israel essentially differ from countries elsewhere breaking up?
Yes, so you can have a secessionist war. That secessionist war is successful if the new country succeeds in establishing actual control that wins international recognition. And then the question is, what are the borders of that country, which would be then the last top level administrative unit. So crucially, there was no Palestinian declaration of independence. There was an invasion by a foreign country, which, as we've discussed with Russia and Ukraine, an aggressive war is not a way of redrawing borders. Were the Palestinians to have a successful secessionary war, and Israel would agree to recognize them, right? So South Sudan only became a country when Sudan agreed to their secession. And then they had to discuss the borders amongst themselves, and they continued to have some actual disputes. But in the end, right, the international community only recognized South Sudan because Sudan agreed, because they had because they successfully won a war. Israel has not agreed to anything like this. Of course, if, let's say, the Palestinians were to fight some kind of new successful war and achieve something like the control that would be characteristic of a state, then you would have to look at the previous top-level administrative units, which is not the West Bank, because the West Bank, of course, is not administered by the Palestinian Authority. You would maybe say Area A of the West Bank and Gaza. But since the Palestinians don't want anything other than everything, that is why they are sort of half-hearted in their even current claims to being a state.
Following on, there are two final questions before I think we'll pivot back to Ukraine. It's a big question, but it's come clearly from quarters that are concerned in the UK with where the debate is shifting in the political sense. What arguments can one make in the UK against calls from some quarters to recognise Palestine as a state? I appreciate there will be many. Perhaps you could give some highlights.
That's a good question. I wasn't expecting that one. First of all, they don't really want a state in a traditional sense. Right? They don't want a state that they would have under international law. Right? Under international, let's say you were to recognize a Palestinian state today. What are its borders? It can't include Area C in Jerusalem because they specifically excluded that from their control in the Oslo Accords. So unless you want to show to Israel, any deal you make, you're just going to be totally screwed and like never make a deal and just try to, be forceful and aggressive and not cooperative and don't make concessions. This would be a bad idea. But under international law, the borders they would have are not the borders they want, right? So you would have to you would have to do two things. You have to recognize a Palestinian state and basically take away Israeli territory or territory to which Israel has a legitimate claim through through caprice, right? And I think if the Palestinians wanted to have a state in Gaza, they could have a state today, right? I think it meets the criteria of a state. I think they have their own territory, they control it, etc. Why don't they declare a state in Gaza? Because they don't want that. They want everything. By the way, in this way, they differ from most national independence movements, right? It's very ironic. There are there are thousands of national independence movements around the world, hundreds maybe, let's say, that invoke statehood prematurely. They don't have a state, but they call themselves the state of whatever. They pretend to have a state long before they do, and because they think some kind of statehood is better than none. The Palestinians, on one hand, claim to be a state. On the other hand, say that we're an occupied people. We don't have anything. Those two arguments are in contradiction because they want to use their own suffering as a wedge, as a lever to amplify their demands. Once their statehood is recognized, they're just another country, right? And it's going to be much harder to amplify their suffering, occupied, etc. But also, they clearly don't meet the criteria of a country. They don't have a clearly defined territory. They don't have, a vaguely defined territory because the Oslo Accords makes final status a condition of negotiations, which they have not conducted in good faith and which they have walked away from. Now, it wouldn't change anything on the ground. It is a very good way to harden right-wing Israeli positions because they'll say, we told you, right? We gave the Palestinians the Palestinian Authority. We gave them control in Area A. We gave them control in Area B. It resulted in an intifada, which killed thousands of Jews. We have put entire areas of historic Jewish homeland and made them effective Jew-free zones. And what do we get for this? It also would, of course, teach the Palestinians a lesson. Intransigence pays off. Right? The more you say no, every time you say no, the international community is going to give you a better offer. Right? If you resort to terror, better offer. If you turn down peace agreements that the mediators, Bill Clinton and others, said were great agreements for the Palestinians, you're going to get a better offer. So instead of actually setting the stage for reconciliation, it will, of course, drive the two sides further apart, and of course be outrageous under international law. But you can also, here's the thing. I remember when Sweden recognized the state of Palestine. They said a couple of things at the time. We can test this. But the problem with Middle East foreign policy stuff is that people can do things and no one ever goes back and evaluates their success. So, or the accuracy of their arguments. For example, I remember just a couple of years ago, every single Middle East expert, certainly those people who were saying to recognize a state of Palestine, were saying that if America moves its embassy to Jerusalem, recognizes Jerusalem, it's going to be World War III, right? It's going to be a devastation of Israel's relation with the Arab countries, and how many lives have to be lost for this symbolic issue, etc. Opposite happened, right? Israel now has the best relations ever with Arab countries. So there should really be a report card for people who make these kind of recommendations. But I remember what Sweden said. First of all, they said, we want to take a step forward to peace. We want to, show Israel that they have to do something for the Palestinians. Of course, they showed Israel the opposite, right? Did it help? No. Secondly, of course, the Swedes are very legally minded, and people kept saying, you've got a problem here, because what about Western Sahara? The Sahrawi also say they have a state, and they also control a certain area, but not all. Why don't? And they're recognized by some countries. Why don't you recognize Sahrawi independence? Now, there's a reason, but it's not a good one. It's not. And so, but the Swedes say, well, they don't really have a country. They don't really control the territory, etc. All these arguments. And they said, you know what? We're going to do the Palestinians first. We're going to think. We're going to really study the Sahrawi issue because we're going to be consistent. We'll get to them next. We'll get to them next. We're just starting with Israel, but we're going to get it. Waiting, right? So it would be a clear breach of international law, which would create a basically single-purpose, sui generis category for Israel, which is not a good look.
I'm going to caveat the next question because I appreciate you're not a representative of the state of Israel. You're
not.
You're an academic, but maybe you have some thoughts. Why has Israel not taken a clear, consistent position on the application of uti possidetis juris?
First of all, you don't need to. You just don't need to. It's not like it's not legally. The whole point of the uti possidetis juris, this principle is used to figure out the borders of countries based on in Latin America based on 300-year-old Spanish maps that they didn't even know exist when they started their dispute. You don't have to invoke it. That's one purpose. Secondly, for the same reason that the Palestinians have such a clear position about their borders, right? Every Palestinian official you'll talk to, every maybe Palestinian who'll be quoted on TV, has a clear position. That's because they're an authoritarian tyranny with no freedom. And so everybody thinks and says the same thing. It is very powerful for getting a message across, right? For having message, first thing in messaging, consistency. First thing that goes out in a multi-party government that has six parties in the current coalition. Also, Israel knows it's because Israel knows something about negotiation theory, which I think is irrelevant in this context because there's no real negotiation, because there's no partner, but it's at least a nice idea. I'm going to end with this observation. The Israelis understand that when you put your arguments in legal terms to your own public, it solidifies and hardens your positions in a way that makes it hard to make compromises, right? If you say all this is ours by right, yes, you can give it away for peace, but maybe it's going to be politically harder. So why just, why state legal entitlements clearly and loudly if you want to negotiate away some of those entitlements? Now, that's part of having an entitlement. You can negotiate it away. But maybe as a sign of seriousness in negotiation, or to prepare a public for it, don't state those claims so vocally. Palestinians, on the other hand, right, they understand the opposite. Once you make maximalist claims, your public, is not going to let you go back, and that's one of the reasons they made maximalist claims. And now in negotiations, they say we can't take less than everything. We're going to be killed. So I think it's a sign that Israel, for many decades negotiated in good faith, and also a sign that the Palestinians were trying to paddle themselves up a river on purpose because they had no intention of paddling back down.
I know you have to leave in a couple of minutes.
I want to say one thing though.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, or maybe we're going to say. I want to just announce an event, an academic conference that I'll be hosting at the Center for the Middle East and International Law in the week after next, on the 6th of April, which deals with some related issues, we've mentioned Turkey in this discussion, we've mentioned Syria. So this is about Turkish population transfer policies in occupied areas of Syria. I'll be joined by a distinguished panel of experts. There's a link for registration if anyone's interested. And that should be a fascinating, somewhat related discussion. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm only sorry we didn't manage to get through all of the questions, but crucial issues, I think, for our audience to be able to take away, especially given so much of the discussion over the last few weeks and the manner in which an awful lot of this is being used against Israel. So thank you very much, Professor Kontorovich. Until next time.
Take care.